Hey guys, welcome to the show where we empower Christian entrepreneurs to build profitable businesses of eternal significance in order to make a redemptive economic impact. I'm your host, Mike Hatch. Hey, I want to take a moment and thank those of you who've actually gone in and tipped me through the Strike link that I provide in the show notes. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Man, does that mean so much. This show is absolutely, completely, and totally listener supported. So it means so much that you would open up your pocketbook or your Bitcoin wallet and provide for the expenses that I have for this podcast. So thank you for that. For those of you who have, there have been a few of you that have. I've seen it come up in the Strike app. And unfortunately, I can't see exactly who you are specifically, but you know who you are. And God knows who you are as well. And I am just really grateful that you chose to invest in this project. Now, if you are someone who is hearing this for the first time, didn't realize you could support, you can. There is a link in the show notes below where you can tip through my Strike account, which is both a dollar account and Bitcoin account. And you can tip me in either dollars or Bitcoin, whichever you choose. Of course, I would prefer Bitcoin. Also, just a reminder, we are 5 weeks into the digital course, which I entitled The Redemptive Enterprise, 15 Biblical Principles to Build a Profitable Business of Eternal Significance. And I would love for you to jump in on this with us. You don't have to attend the live sessions, but I do have live sessions every Wednesday at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time if you'd like to join us. But if you register for the course, you will get access to each new session on a weekly basis. And again, this is building to being a 12-part series, and it's all of it is offered for only $25. So the barrier of entry is really low. So the links for that digital course, again, are in the show notes, so go check that out. All right, gang, this week we are talking about a topic that's making a lot of business owners nervous, and that is the bond market turmoil, rising interest rates, and the looming impact on debt, investments, and our economy. How do we, as Christian business leaders, respond redemptively in times like these? Let's first start with the basics. A bond. What is a bond? Because some people don't know. Some people, even if you're in business, you might not know what a bond is. But a bond is essentially a loan. It's an IOU from a government or a corporation. Investors lend money in exchange for regular interest payments, plus the promise to get their principal back at maturity or at the end of the length of the bond, if it's 5 years, 10 years, 3 years, whatever. Historically, bonds were considered stable investments, a safe harbor in stormy times. In fact, investment advisors would tell you to own a certain ratio of stocks to bonds in order to balance out the risk. But lately, the bond market has been anything but stable. Yields are spiking, prices are plummeting, and investors rightly are worried. Rising interest rates driven by central banks trying to tame inflation means existing bonds lose value. And for businesses, that means borrowing costs are rising and debt servicing is getting more and more expensive. For entrepreneurs, this volatility is more than a Wall Street problem. It affects business loans and lines of credit, home mortgages and real estate projects, even the value of your business if you rely on borrowed money to grow. And look, gang, I'm going to try to be as clear about this as possible, okay? Bonds are bondage. Literally, the word bond, as you might guess, comes from the same root as bondage. When you buy or sell bonds, you're engaging in a system of promises, a system that creates obligations and, in many cases, enslavement. Government bonds are especially corrupt and exploitive instruments that Christians, honestly, from my perspective, should not be engaged in. And now, as bond market turmoil kicks up, we are feeling the negative effects of trusting in the government rather than trusting in God. We're doing the same thing Israel did in 1 Samuel chapter 8 when they demanded a king to rule over them and fight battles on their behalf. And in 1 Samuel chapter 8, God warned Israel. He said, in verse 11, he said, this king will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots, to run before his chariots. In verse 13, he says he will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. Verse 14, he will take the best of your fields and vineyards and give them to his officials. Verse 15, he will take a tenth of your grain and of your vineyards. And then the punchline, verse 17, and you will become his slaves. And then he goes on and says, and in that day you will cry out because of the king that you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day. That's verse 18. Buying government bonds is fundamentally placing your trust in the state, believing that the government is your protector and your provider. Just like ancient Israel demanding a king, modern investors trust the state to manage their money, promising security and return on investment. But just as Israel's king would enslave them through taxation and forced labor, governments today, and we're seeing it today, repay bonds through taxation and inflation, effectively enslaving the people through financial servitude. So when we invest in these bonds, we're endorsing and participating in a system that funds the state's coercive powers rather than relying on God's provision and the voluntary exchange of value in the marketplace. So look, government bonds actually betray all sorts of redemptive economic principles. First of all, it contradicts principle number 1 under stewardship under God's dominion, that we acknowledge God's absolute sovereignty over all creation and the lordship of Jesus Christ over all areas of life. In place of that, we're not trusting God, we're entrusting ourselves to the government. Principle number 2, we trust in God's goodness, embracing both an abundance mentality and an enthusiasm to be fruitful and multiply, all of which is rooted in faith, wisdom, and diligence. Of course, we're not trusting in God's goodness as we buy government bonds. Instead, we are trusting in the government to provide for us. Of course, principle number 5 that I talk about all the time, where we uphold honest money, ethical banking, and investment practices in obedience to God's commands for just weights and measures. We reject theft through inflation, unjust taxation, and financial corruption, instead seeking to honor God in all our economic transactions. And then under the category of cooperating in God's redemptive plan, principle number 1 states that as God's covenant people entrusted with the ministry of reconciliation, all economic activity must reflect God's redemptive plan for bringing justice, mercy, and truth into the marketplace, where instead government bonds do quite the opposite of being unjust and unmerciful and enslaving the public and the people. And then principle number 3, under creating kingdom value through faithful work, I say that through business and trade, we act as conduits of God's blessing, providing for our families and communities while modeling kingdom values. Well, when we're buying government bonds, we are not being conduits of God's blessing at all. In fact, it's extractive and takes advantage of the most vulnerable populations. When governments or corporations issue bonds to fund their spending, they're not just making a promise, they're binding their citizens to future payments. So it's financial servitude is what it amounts to. But as we know, God's design is for freedom. Of course, remember when Jesus stood up in the synagogue and declared who he was and his mission by reading Isaiah 61:1. What did he say? He said, he quoted that verse by saying, "He has sent me to proclaim freedom to the captives," right? That's God's heart, is freedom. That's why in redemptive economics, we challenge the systems that keep people in bondage, whether that's literal slavery or hidden chains of unjust debt. We build businesses that liberate, that create value, and that reflect God's justice and mercy. This is the call of the Christian entrepreneur. So again, bonds in many cases represent a promise from the government that's funded by future taxation and often by inflating the monetary supply. Both of these erode real value and violate the biblical principles that I just previously mentioned. And this has profound implications for how we think about investing in government debt or relying on debt to run our businesses. As Christian entrepreneurs, we must resist the temptation to place our trust in human governments and their debt-based systems. Instead, we're called to steward resources under God's dominion. So we are His stewards, investing in productive enterprises, supporting human flourishing, and building businesses of eternal significance that reflect His justice, mercy, and truth. When we invest in government bonds today, we're actually echoing Israel's mistake from 1 Samuel chapter 8. We're saying we trust the state to protect and provide for us, but the state repays bonds by taxing and inflating away the wealth of its citizens, binding them to financial servitude. That's modern-day bondage. Engaging in redemptive economics is all about trusting in the Lord's provision, to invest in productive enterprises that create value, to resist the temptation to finance the very systems that enslave us. Let's remember Psalm chapter 118, verse 8. It says, "It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in man." And we're seeing the consequences of trusting in man, in our government specifically, right now as the bond market is blowing up. On the surface, bonds look like a low-risk way to earn returns, but they are claims on future production, money that will be extracted from taxpayers or consumers without producing any extra value. When governments or corporations issue bonds, they are creating future claims on the labor and resources of others. Every bond is a promise to extract value from future taxpayers or consumers. This financial promise binds both the issuer and ultimately the citizens, often without their consent. It's a form of financial servitude. Then inflation, which is commonly utilized in modern bond markets, quietly erodes the purchasing power of money, functioning like a hidden tax that steals value from everyone. Interestingly enough, there are all sorts of warnings in the Old Testament with regards to these kind of things, like Isaiah chapter 10, verses 1 through 2. "Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of their rights." And guess what? Bonds are these very things that fund unjust or corrupt systems which enslave entire populations. Again, as Christian entrepreneurs and business leaders, we're called to reject systems that enslave people, whether that's through unjust taxation, inflation, or financial instruments that extract value from others. Instead, we should invest in real value creation, businesses that produce goods and services, create jobs, and honor God's design for stewardship and flourishing. So look, if you are a government or a corporation who has inflated their debt by issuing bonds, you have leveraged an inflationary monetary system, an unjust and corrupt inflationary monetary system, eroding real value and the value of everybody's dollars who are holding them. So inflation at its core, again, is a form of theft by stealth. It reduces the value of the money you hold, robbing workers, savers, and small businesses. That's why Proverbs 22, verse 7 warns us that the borrower is slave to the lender. Debt creates a dynamic where freedom is exchanged for servitude. Romans 13:8 encourages us to owe no one anything except to love each other. Is that the way that you're running your business? We as Christian entrepreneurs need to ask some really tough questions in times like this. Now, you might be asking exactly how do corporate bonds contribute to inflation, the devaluation of the dollar? Well, in an indirect way, it does. In today's financial system, central banks often lower interest rates and engage in quantitative easing. You've probably heard that. Buying government and sometimes even corporate bonds to stimulate borrowing. These low rates incentivize companies to issue more bonds and take on more debt. Companies often use borrowed money from bonds to buy back their own shares, artificially inflating the stock market. This can fuel asset bubbles, where asset prices rise faster than underlying economic value, creating the illusion of wealth that spills over into higher spending. When stock prices rise disproportionately, consumer spending can also increase, contributing to demand-side inflation. Massive corporate bond issuance often redirects money away from productive investments like new factories, technologies, or employee training toward financial engineering, essentially money chasing money rather than value creation. This distortion reduces productive capacity in the long term, which can exacerbate inflation when demand outstrips the capacity to supply goods and services. So while corporate bonds themselves might not directly expand the money supply, the central banking system that incentivizes and purchases them can enable this cycle of borrowing, spending, and asset inflation, contributing to a system that distorts value and erodes honest money. So corporate bonds in isolation aren't inherently inflation, but in the modern debt-fueled central bank-supported system, they are a part of a broader, insidious inflationary mechanism. Low interest rates lead to easier debt issuance, lead to increased borrowing, lead to more money chasing the same goods and services, which of course leads to inflation. Excessive corporate debt also makes the economy fragile. Companies must service their debt, which can cause them to raise prices or cut back on real value creation when rates rise. I've seen this personally with some local businesses here in Pittsburgh who took on SBA loans that are now way more expensive because of the rise of interest rates. This puts pressure on the business to cut back on expenses and provide less value in many ways to the customer because they're overwhelmed by the burden, the bondage of the debt that they have found themselves in. So while government bonds are more directly inflationary through money creation, corporate bonds participate in the same debt-driven cycle that fuels inflationary pressures and financial instability. As redemptive entrepreneurs, we must discern the systems we participate in and seek to build businesses on real value, ethical finance, and honest money that honors God and promotes human flourishing. So take an honest look at yourself and your own business. Are you trusting in the world's debt system or in God's provision? Are you investing in systems that exploit others, like inflationary government debt? Or are we building real value that blesses people and honors God? These are really important questions, especially now that we have to be asking as Christian business owners. So what are some of the things we can do as business owners? Number one, and this is going to seem obvious, but prioritize paying down high interest debt, of course. If rising rates are making your payments unsustainable, like so many others that I've known, especially with these SBA loans that were taken through COVID, man, it's time to make a plan to reduce or restructure that debt so that you can weather this storm. Yes, in the short term, it is going to be painful. It is going to be painful. But in the long term, it's going to create much more sustainability for you to produce incredible value for your customers. Number two, build financial resilience. Maybe you need to develop a cash reserve that allows you to ride out market volatility and avoid panic borrowing. Of course, the number one tool that I recommend is Bitcoin. I've talked about it before, but man, more and more businesses are starting to see the value of having a strategic Bitcoin reserve where you have an honest money that is growing in value and is deflationary instead of inflationary, which much more honors the image of God that's present in every human being. By the way, if you want to learn more about that specifically, I'm a consultant with Sovreign.io, which is a business Bitcoin consulting company. And there's links in the show notes below you can check out to learn more. There are resources actually too that they offer to help you understand how to integrate Bitcoin into your business. I would strongly recommend that you check that out. Number three, how about we rethink our investments? Instead of chasing bonds that do not align with honest money principles, consider investments that create real value and maybe looking locally versus just in the stock market. Maybe it's time to think about leveraging your unique wealth of knowledge on a local level so that you can provide value and have a redemptive influence. And fourthly, use debt strategically, not habitually. Debt can be a tool to build, but it must be used carefully and redemptively, always seeking to serve others and expand God's kingdom, not just to chase quick gains. Again, if you're issuing corporate bonds, it should be honest. The people who are buying those bonds and entrusting their hard-earned money that they've had saved up, it should be a reflection of the value that you are producing already and a clear path for growing that value in the future. So look, this moment in the bond market that we're all facing and the broader economy is a reminder that God's kingdom is not subject to the same vulnerabilities as the world's systems. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven." Every decision you make about money, how you invest, how you use debt, how you steward your business matters to God and has eternal impact. Man, I hope that this episode has brought you some perspective on what's going on in our economy right now. If you found today's episode helpful, by the way, would you share it with a fellow entrepreneur who might be wrestling with these same questions? And if you want to dive deeper, check out our digital course. Again, link in the show notes on the 15 redemptive economic principles. The digital course is called the Redemptive Enterprise, 15 biblical principles to build a profitable business of eternal significance. The other thing I'd love to encourage you about is maybe if you're enduring some of these struggles and challenges and you feel alone and isolated, man, especially if you're in the Pittsburgh region, come join one of our Truth at Work peer advisory groups where it is a 4-hour monthly 4-hour power-packed meeting where you'll get to glean all sorts of wisdom from a biblical perspective on how to build your business from other Christian business leaders who have a ton of experience themselves. You don't have to walk this road alone. Together, let's build businesses that are profitable and eternally significant. Let's get to work!